Thanks, Can. Corla, and I'm delighted to have a brief chance to say a few words about Budget 2020. I have to say at the outset, Can, it was absolutely laughable to listen earlier today to Deputy McGrath and Fianna Fáil spokespersons criticising Fine Gael and Minister Donoghue, given that once again, of course, Fianna Fáil's own fingerprints are all over the budget that was read out this afternoon by Minister Donoghue. Indeed, as I mentioned to Taoiseach Varadkar, I think last year, you might remember, Can, when I was asking him about the huge levels of tax expenditures in this country and what effort he was making to reduce those tax expenditures, to examine them, even to make, to bring in any kind of sense of accountability for those expenditures. I remember mentioning to the Taoiseach that, of course, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil have now delivered, I suppose, about a dozen budgets together since early 2009. If you trace it back, Can, to the crash, and then the two budgets that followed, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael trooped in behind Fianna Fáil, and then when got to 2011, we had Fianna Fáil heading up towards that side of the Dáil, voting resolutely behind Fine Gael. And since, of course, 2016, we've had this bizarre Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil government. But the vast bulk of those dozen budgets, of course, were savage austerity budgets. And today, in balance, I think what the two parties have returned to is to the austerity path, following, of course, a few years of restoration, of brief restoration and easing financial pressures on ordinary citizens. Indeed, I think a distinguished journalist there, I just noticed, Fionnan Sheehan, said that Brexit was used as a cloak covering the void of vision and Donoghue's Bertienomics. Yeah, it's another chapter of the Bertienomics since 2008. Today, of course, the income, Can Corla, of our most vulnerable citizens on social welfare assistance and benefits were frozen, absolutely frozen, despite the crocodile tears from Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael about assisting citizens most exposed to Brexit and the mitigating measures that were necessary to combat climate change. Workers, of course, received no income tax boost whatsoever through personal income tax. There was no moving towards a living wage, Minister, disgracefully again. As my colleague Deputy Pringle says, I mean, if you wanted to create a strong enough demand among our citizens, those dependent on social welfare income and also the workforce, surely today would have had some of those measures, some mitigating measures in relation to relief in personal income tax bans and also in relation to social welfare. And I myself, Minister, I presented Minister Donoghue with my own brief submission on behalf of myself and colleagues, which was called, I think, a budget to protect our people, I quote, in the age of Brexit and climate change. And I thought a fundamental instrument in order to protect our people was to come up with some kind of a reasonable rise in social protection, pensions and benefits. I advocated €7 a week, Minister, at a cost of about under 500 million. And you resolutely said no. You absolutely refused to, in any way, increase the income of these most vulnerable citizens. You had an opportunity. I know that you personally, Minister Stanton, it's something that you might have felt at least maybe a €5 a week increase should have been there. But Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, they froze the social protection budget in a most disgraceful manner this afternoon. That is one fundamental message. And far from attempting to mitigate Brexit and mitigate climate change for our most vulnerable citizens, you ran away from that challenge. Absolutely ran away from it. You could have balanced a budget. Some of our colleagues, my colleague Deputy Pringle, our colleague Deputy Richard Boyd-Barrett, have indicated sources of revenue we know that are there, that you could have sourced. I advocated also the increase in in the levy on commercial property, which the Minister has more or less agreed to. But there was a whole range of other measures that could also have been used to raise revenue to balance budgets. And we have been. I'm a member of the Budget Committee, our Budget Oversight Committee, probably along with the Sláinte Care Committee, one of the best reforms of this Dáil, and for what I hope this Dáil will be remembered for, along with the Parliamentary Budget Office. In those areas, when we've met bodies, or in those committees, when we've met bodies like the IFAC, the Irish Financial, the Advisory Council, they're constantly asking us, if you're going to increase expenditure like today by 6.4%, get the revenue of 6.4%. Well, we needed a bigger increase if we were to protect our people, Minister. The revenue could have been attained. You refused to do it. And this is ideological. It's yourselves and Fianna Fáil against most of the rest of us. You're not prepared to take the steps that are necessary to increase net policy spending to protect the bulk of our people from whether it's a crash-out Brexit or any kind of a disorderly Brexit, or indeed from the future impacts of climate change. So it has to be said, Ceann Comhairle, that curtailing wages and salaries, curtailing social protection benefits, I think is a grave error by this government. And when you do look back, of course, over the last 10 years of budgets, the gulf between the rich and the poor in this country, it continues to widen. I think through its poor performance on housing in particular, Fine Gael is normalising homelessness and indeed robbing a generation of children of their childhood. Vulture funds, co-living developers and other private developers are feasting off our dysfunctional housing and rental market. Hundreds of thousands of people, of course, are languishing on a waiting list for our health services. Somebody put a round figure, I think, of 1 million of our citizens waiting for acute hospital services, waiting for outpatients, waiting for therapeutic, children waiting for assessments, children with serious disability, waiting years for assessment. All of that has happened on your watch, Minister, over the last 9 painful years for this country. Of course, as the Minister said, unemployment may have fallen to, he said, 5.3%. I think I had 5.2% here in my own figure. But of course, we've had a huge increase in precarious employment, zero-hour contracts, bogus self-employment, and again, Fine Gael, with Fianna Fáil supporting them, have allowed that kind of employment situation to develop in this country. This is the Ireland, unfortunately, that Fine Gael, as I said, propped up by those Fine Gael independents of Fianna Fáil. They've nurtured and stoked over the past decade, and giving to the few and leaving the many to suffer. And indeed, I think when the government ends, Ceann Comhairle, it's a shameful legacy, and it'll probably take several Dáil and hopefully much more progressive governments to fix. The European Anti-Poverty Network, the EAPN, Ireland, and the 30 members of the Community Platform, they set out 4 tests. 4 reasonable tests, Ceann Comhairle, for Budget 2020. And they included whether income will be redistributed towards the poorest 20%, whether the budget will strengthen access to quality employment, whether the government will restore and strengthen public services serving people on lowest incomes, and whether Budget 2020 will be poverty and inequality proofed. Now, those 4 simple tests, Ceann Comhairle, were clearly failed today by this government, notwithstanding the threat of Brexit and dealing with climate change. So I think they were important tests. I think a reasonable government would have framed its response in the context of those tests, and unfortunately the Minister didn't take them on board. And of course the 30 members of the Community Platform, they're well-known, long-standing, important organisations who interact with us deputies constantly, such as Age Action Ireland, Focus Ireland, the Irish Refugee Council, National Forum for Family Resource Centres and the National Adult Literacy Agency, to name just a few. And I think they did set out reasonable and generally costed requests to address the ongoing serious inequality in Irish society and the significant gaps in service provision. But again, under the cloak of Brexit and under the cloak of climate mitigation, this government totally refused to address these matters today. In my own submission to Minister Donoghue, as I said, which I called a budget to protect our people in the age of Brexit and climate change, I did ask that we would have a Brexit fund of perhaps up to €2 billion, because when you do start trying to cost the kind of very difficult situation our business and agriculture and our rural families and urban families may be facing, you start coming into the territory of 1 to 2 billion. And therefore, obviously, I welcome the fact that we do have this fund, promised fund today of 1.2 billion. Our Parliamentary Budget Office alone, for example, is so hard, obviously, and it is difficult to make estimates of what could happen if there was a crash out either after Halloween or later. And the PBO, of course, estimated that the increases in job seekers allowance, JSA and job seekers benefit alone could be over €100 million in 2020 in the event of a no-deal Brexit, and that could rise to over €900 million by 2029. And obviously that would anticipate very significant rises in levels of unemployment in sectors deeply affected by Brexit. So it is important that that €650 million is being made available to support agriculture, enterprise and tourism, and that there will be €220 million will be ready immediately in the event of a crash-out Brexit. And Minister, it was very hard to find out, by the way, up to this stage in 2019. I think the PBO tried to find out how much money has been spent on Brexit so far. It seemed to be in the order of there seem to be estimates of 100 to 200 million, but I mean some of the fund, some of the contingency action fund seem to indicate that there was more spending, but even in the past spending so far, we don't seem to have a very clear picture. Given, of course, the continuing huge burden of our national debt, we still have that debt of, is it €43,000 or so per capita, every man, woman and child in this country. And given that, it was dispiriting to listen to Minister Donoghue this afternoon saying that he would have to turn to borrowing, that the response might have to be to start borrowing again and to start building up our national debt again. As I reiterated, I think, in my own submission to Minister Donoghue, surely the European Union should be providing perhaps up to 70 or 75% of the additional costs and impacts of our economy to protect the single market in Ireland. And that was one thing that's missing again in Minister Donoghue's speech today. I mean, what kind of help will Europe be actually going to give us? What real practical help? There doesn't seem to be any figures being talked about at all, Minister. I don't know whether you've heard anything, but the kind of funding that Europe is going to make available to us. It wasn't today Chancellor Merkel is supposed to have told Prime Minister Boris Johnson that if Germany was leaving the European Union, it wouldn't have the same issues as Britain leaving because of the situation in Ireland and because we have to insist on the backstop. Although the Danes, with their huge agricultural exports to Germany, they might have actually had some comments to make on Chancellor Merkel's view. But whatever happens, obviously, the country most affected should be able to expect very significant additional resources from the European Union. We need to see that coming, not just verbal support for us in the negotiations. Of course, other speakers today, I did agree with Deputy McGrath and others who complained about the lack of detail in the operation of the contingency action plans and the fact that we're coming so close now, Minister, 20 days, and still there still is a danger, despite the more positive news from today or early today before we started the budget, that maybe there won't be a crash out at Halloween. But we still don't have any detail of how particularly businesses in the border region are impacted through the border region, how they will actually be supported. And obviously that's an area where the Minister of Finance and the Taoiseach, they should be able to give very detailed plans, and also, of course, to indicate where the funding supports will come from. Because the key point is, Minister, when you do look through today's budget papers, the national debt last year, or this current year, we were paying €5.5 billion, and that's half the budget of the Department of Education, for example. A third of the budget of health. It's a savage amount of money, that we're paying in interest on our national debt. I think, of course, we also, we make a contribution of about €2.5 billion to the European Union, and we're, for the last, is it 5 years now or 6 years, we're of course a net contributor to the European Union. The Minister, of course, said that adjusting to decarbonising the economy, he said it won't be easy for everyone, I quote, but surely it's the understatement of the day. The €6 increase in carbon tax, of course, it raises €90 million, and the 1% nitrogen oxide emissions-based charge, I think, will realise something like €2.5 million. But the key point about these, Minister, is they don't seem to have been hypothecated. I mean, where is the flow of this money to protecting the most vulnerable people in energy poverty? I mean, St Vincent de Paul, I know, did a study, and they estimated that perhaps up to 28% of our households endured some kind of energy poverty. I remember when I was a spokesperson on energy myself some years ago. At that stage, we were talking about maybe 15% or so, maybe 1 in 7 households had very significant energy poverty. But there's nothing today, or that I can see anyway, in these budget papers in front of me, to indicate how are you hypothecating that money to try and help those most vulnerable households. We've talked about retrofitting and so on, but it still seems to be, a very vague area. The Just Transition Fund, of course, we're told will be commenced, but it only has, I think, a starting funding of €6 million. And then again, we're told it's this new position of Commissioner for the Just Transition Fund. You just wonder, why do we need that kind of position? Why can't the department, Deputy Bruton's department, just establish the Just Transition Fund and administer that fund itself? In all of those contexts, of course, the actual mitigation, if you like, the actual hypothecation, rather, resulting in the increase of €2 a week in the fuel allowance, of course, it's derisory. Many of us asked the Minister, for example, to increase the length of the fuel allowance season by at least a couple of weeks. He refused to do that as well today. But the real thing a lot of people will be asking, of course, is, what happened to the Taoiseach's great plans for a tax and dividend approach to carbon taxation, the actual return of levied carbon taxes to citizens and families most deeply impacted by energy poverty? I mean, what happened to tax and dividend? I asked the Minister for Finance this precise question a couple of weeks ago, but again, he didn't seem to be able to give us any further information. Obviously, the idea that in addition to other helps, the actual fact that people might see any additional money they had to spend in carbon taxation or in getting themselves around, that it would be literally directly given back to them, it seems a very attractive one. But again, it seems to have disappeared completely off the agenda. And one of the issues, of course, I raised myself was the equalisation of tax on diesel and on petrol, which I think the UK went through that equalisation a number of years ago, which helped the Exchequer, but which also obviously helped to make diesel fuelled cars less attractive. But again, the Minister again has simply refused to remotely consider going down that road. I note, however, that when you look across the whole European Union, Minister, we're often portrayed as a laggard by some people in this House, a total laggard in climate change. But I think I read recently in The Economist that the Germans, they're only speculating about initiating their carbon tax at around €10 a tonne by 2021. Which a country that is often held to be, because it's had the Greens several times in government, and they've been doing well at the polls again. But it seems to be do as I say as regards Germany, Germany's views on climate change. Do as I say, not do as I do. And of course, it's they also. I mean, one of the things today, while most people would be in support of bringing attention to the urgency global warming. People often ask, I mean, why isn't there, for example, and again going back to Germany, why isn't there more focus on, for example, companies on the car industry, the industry that builds cars, that builds these behemoths of jeeps and gas-guzzling monsters of cars and vehicles? How come there's not some kind of focus in that area to ask people to come up with more hybrids, more climate-friendly vehicles, and indeed more safer vehicles? Because we know, generally speaking, smaller vehicles that can speed less are much safer vehicles. But again, it does seem that to some extent in our own country we are isolated, or we're sometimes highlighted as as being incredible laggards in this area. But we don't have an indigenous car industry, and similarly, of course, big business in terms of the use of plastic and so on and so forth. I mean, households are always being remonstrated with, etc., to be more climate friendly, etc. And yet, I mean, a lot of the plastics and the non-recyclable covers that we're asked to take, all of that comes from business, and it's business maybe across Europe that needs to take a different role. So I think tonight we'll be discussing obviously the carbon tax again, but it does seem that you failed, Minister, in any hypothecation to make it fairer for the most vulnerable of our families. It was a Leader's Questions last week, you might remember, Can Corla. Taoiseach Simon Coveney said that rebuilding Ireland, it needed, and I quote, an injection of adrenaline in Budget 2020. Well, the only adrenaline I could see, there was a 2.5 million budget, but there was 2.5 billion. It was 2.4 billion last year. So it was in this massive problem facing all of our constituencies. You come up today, Minister, with a princely sum in terms of what we have to do in housing of 100 million. So where was the shot of adrenaline that the Taoiseach was looking for? He certainly didn't get it. And of course, he's the former Minister for Housing. And as I said, Minister Donoghue's allocation was 2.5 billion in 2020, 2019 2.4. But it's still, as we can see, the record of 2018-2019, the government has signally failed to deliver the 30 to 35,000 minimum social and affordable homes we need every single year. And as I mentioned, of course, last week, and several deputies have mentioned, 1,000 plus homeless citizens, 4,000 homeless children, most shameful record for this government. Well over 140,000 households on council waiting lists. I think half on the waiting list, half in HAP, but people feeling that they'll never get a forever home where they can lay their head and feel this is my place. There was an opportunity again today, as Deputy Coveney seemed to want to have done something seriously drastic about this matter. The Minister, of course, says €1.1 billion has been allocated to help deliver 11,000 new social homes in 2020. But I think the €80 million he set aside for HAP shows that, and HAP, by the way, the budget minister, as you know, I think is it 430 million or something this year. It's £500 million practically. So he's given another 80 million. It shows that he's still relying mainly, and your party and Fianna Fáil, you're mainly relying on landlords to house, I think it's 16,000, he said, new tenancies in 2020. So the situation with the developer-led, landlord-led housing programme, this ideological straitjacket into which Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil have fitted down through the decades, you're continuing in it, and you're telling those people that we meet day in, day out, on the streets, sleeping in cars and vans, in emergency accommodation, people maybe who have been on the list since 2005, on the Fingal list maybe since 2005 or 2006, or the Dublin City list maybe for 18 years. You're telling them in 2020 you will not get your own place, you won't get a home. That's the absolute reality. And sadly, of course, Taoiseach Coveney, if he was serious about the injection of adrenaline into housing, he's been ignored. And I mean, what I think many of us on this side of the House wanted was significant funding for the Land Development Agency and the local authorities to start to build a massive social and affordable housing programme, and the kind of programme, obviously, that would at long last begin to address. There's my own constituency, Minister, as I mentioned last week, my own constituency, we have in the Dublin City housing area, I think we have 5,000 households and families on the basic housing list. We have a couple of thousand more, well 3,000 more I think on transfer lists. We have on the Fingal side, I think we have up to 2,000 households. So everything you did this year would not be sufficient to house the people who are waiting in Dublin Bay North. And it's only one, it's a 5-seater constituency, obviously, only one constituency out of the 40. So just everything you did this year would not be enough to help us. And we have the other 39 or 40 constituencies as well. So I do think a massive effort was needed in this regard, which simply hasn't happened. I do welcome, of course, the minimal help from the Help to Buy scheme. And I notice it's been extended into 2021. But overall, I think in housing, this was another budget which, again, the government essentially stood still. And the kind of national effort that we needed and which we were able to carry out before, in the years before 2007 in relation to housing, it simply hasn't happened. The Minister for Finance earlier today, of course, he had very little to say about the ongoing crisis in the health sector. With nearly 1 million citizens, I think now, waiting for acute hospital beds, outpatient and therapeutic services. We were told, I think, before that a supplementary budget of about €300 million was needed to support Vote 38 in 2019, despite the staff recruitment embargoes, which are clearly being operated by the Chief Executive, Paul Reid, and the HSE itself. It was still going to be at least a €300 million supplementary budget. But that's why I think we've had this discussion a lot, Minister, about on the health budget at the Budget Oversight Committee, and the fact that for the past 2 years, I suppose, it's been quite obvious that the allocations for health are simply too low. I mean, you can look at efficiencies, all the efficiencies you like, but the simple reality is we don't have enough hospital beds, we don't have enough consultants, we don't have enough GPs. You compare us with exemplars like the Scandinavian countries, and we're not at the races remotely by comparison. We don't have enough social workers, we don't have enough therapists all across the system, and we kind of feel that budget. Now, today the Minister laid out a budget of 17.4 million. But again, I think, and any reasonable student of the health sector, and we all, of course, will be dealing with health issues day in, weekend out in our lives as deputies. When you look through Vote 28 for the in the health area, it is very despondent. It's very disappointing to look at the kind of figures that this government has come up with. For example, disability services. There's a new a commitment that all the 18-year-old school leavers should have access to supports, and I think Deputy McGrath would be Deputy Finney McGrath would be talking about 1,600 young people. There's respite, emergency protocol. There's a programme for autism. But the total programme, as far as I can see in this, Minister, is the total additional programme for disability is only €25 million. Now, again, I'm a member of the informal committee we have on disability, which is brilliantly chaired, of course, by Senator John Dolan. I think the Disability Federation of Ireland and the Disability Committee, they wanted a minimum commitment of an investment programme of €211 million over the next 5 years. But it's nowhere in this budget. The figure is 25 million here. So once again, unfortunately, Deputy McGrath, who has failed to come in here and bring the optional protocol on disability services, Deputy Finney McGrath, Minister Finney McGrath. No, I know you're a supporter. Yeah, Deputy Matthew McGrath is a supporter of implementing the optional protocol of the United Nations Convention. But it hasn't been done, and the total figure here, 25 million, is very disappointing. And then when you look at others, I mean, I did urge the Minister to bring the National Treatment Purchase Fund, to bring it up to 100 million, and in other words, to increase by 25 million, and he has, of course, done that. So I welcome that. I welcome also, obviously, extending the GP service to the under 8s. And the dental service to the under 6s. But I mean, when you actually look at 10 million for palliative care, one of the most disappointing ones as well, besides disability services, mental health. My colleague Deputy Connolly has constantly asked the government to implement Vision for Change, and here, the basic funding seems to be for obviously the National Forensic Mental Health Hospital at Broughan, 13 million. But again, the government, I think, has refused to carry out this responsibility. So, looking at Chapter 12 of the Budget 2020 Expenditure Report on health spending, it's disappointing, Minister, and clearly the overall figure is just too low. And we need to get to have serious, realistic health budgets, and it should be perhaps at least €1 billion, maybe €1.5 billion higher. As I said, far from implementing Vision for Change, only €13 million extra has been allocated to mental health. And the €97 million, of course, package for older persons is welcome, but again, it's less than half probably what's required for home care packages and the nursing home support scheme. As I said, I'm a member of the Oireachtas Disability Group. Besides the investment programme and the optional protocol, of course, the group has called for a whole range of improvements for the disability sector. And again, it's disappointing today that in that area, and also in areas like family carers, the government simply has failed to respond. The upsurge, of course, in antisocial behaviour and crime in Dublin Bay North and other constituencies, it does need a vigorous response from government, but the increase of €81 million in the Garda budget, I think, won't do very much to accelerate the 2020 target, I think, of 21,000 Garda personnel. Indeed, Minister, as your own department, I think the overall increase of €120 million seems small enough in the context of Commissioner Harris's plans for frontline policing and the necessary doubling in size, which we want, obviously, of the traffic police. So, again, that's another area where I think there's been minimum movement by the government. My colleague, Deputy Pringle, mentioned, of course, the whole area of public transport and the again, failure of the government to, I think, expedite and be much more urgent about the development of public transport systems. And I notice again, of course, the bulk of the capital money, or the highest figures for the capital allocations for Transport, Minister, are they're allocated for 2021 and 22. But I mean, we ask, say, in this city, well, where's the progress on Metrolink? In Middle Leinster and this city, we ask, where's the progress on, say, commuter rail? Why isn't the government looking again at reopening the Navan line? And of course, we all support, I think, Lewis light rail systems for Cork, Limerick, Galway and Waterford. But even those, those developments, those ideas, all seems to be at just very basic planning stages. There doesn't seem to be a serious attempt by government to come up with a public transport. I mean, if we want to get cars off the roads, and obviously we can cycle, we can walk, but we do need a modern transport system. And indeed, it is extraordinary that in Dublin, there isn't a fixed line system to the airport, unlike virtually every other European capital. Even Bus Connects, the railway renewal programme, Minister, they seem to be kind of mired in lethargy. In relation to childcare, of course, there is a welcome increase, but it's small enough, I suppose, of 94 million to the department, to Minister Sapone. And I did, I think, in my own submission, ask for an increase to TUSLA of about 50 million, because we had constantly raised, I think, at questions with the childcare department, with the children's department, the difficulty in recruiting social workers to carry out, obviously, much needed assessments and inspections. So you've increased TUSLA's budget, I notice, Minister, by 29 million, I think, up to 814 million. But as I said, I think you should have gone to at least 50 million in that regard. The 54 million, of course, for early learning and childcare is welcome also. But one of the campaigns, of course, a lot of us were involved with, from the Children's Rights Alliance, you remember, Minister, from all parties in the House, was No Child 2020, which was a range of improvements, for example, a hot meal for children in school, free school books and so on, to improve the lives of every child in this country. And the reality is, Minister, as far as I can see, the No Child 2020 programme, it was totally unaddressed by the Minister for Finance here today. Throughout, of course, the last year, we've all met our primary teachers, our secondary teachers. We had the Irish Universities Association over in Buswell's, Minister, a month or so ago, met our local university, in my case DCU, and so on. And there is an increase in the education budget, but clearly, I mean, I think we do have, due to the quality of our teachers, support of our parents, and indeed the quality of our students, we probably have a world-class education system, and it's kind of critical that we keep it at that level. I was struck, for example, particularly by the submissions of the National Principals Forum. They complained bitterly about the fact that the 5,000 posts of responsibility before the crash had not been restored. One of the biggest problems that arose in the education area last CAN was in relation to ASD units in primary school, when children with autism finished primary school, wanted to go on to second level. There's virtually no system there for the Minister. And again, in this, there's a special capitation for children with disability at primary level in ASD units, but there's no such capitation at second level. I think we all met a great campaigner from Cork, a few months ago, who wants us to replicate the improvements in provision for children with disability at second level that we had at first level, but it's not in this budget. I think USI, the Union of Students, they asked for a 1.26 billion investment programme in higher level education down to 2030. And of course, as I said, we met the Irish Universities Association, and of course they're very concerned, Minister, that when you look at all these rankings, I don't agree with ranking schools or with ranking universities, but there is a number of international league tables, and Irish universities have been, however you look at it, they've been tumbling down them, where once obviously UCD and Trinity and DCU and Galway and all our other colleges, were fairly highly placed. There hasn't been the same level of support. People would put it to me, for example, to take St Andrews University in Scotland, which has been often credited with being the #1 university in the world. The levels of support that would get from the Scottish Government or the London University colleges that they would get from the overall British Government, the same kind of support is simply not here in our system. So I did, like I think other people who might have made budget submissions, as I said earlier on, I think there are revenues there that the government could have tapped. If you look across the whole range, for example, just thinking of my colleague, Deputy Mick Wallace, who brought in a bill here in relation to the levies on I think it was the Urban Regeneration Housing Amendment Bill. It was the vacant site levy, yeah. And Deputy Wallace at that stage, Mick Wallace MEP, he indicated that you could get 100 million from that. Again, the Minister completely ran away from that. Many of us have felt that there should be a higher rate of income tax, my final point, perhaps of 43% on incomes over 100,000, which we know would yield, from the Ready Reckoner tells us that it would yield at least 264 million. If you put it over 80,000, Minister, it would get you £500 million. But again, this Minister refused. So all in all, I think it was it's a standstill budget. It didn't protect our citizens, certainly from the impacts that a no-deal Brexit could have on us, or from the impacts that changes in relation to carbon taxation, in relation to climate change. And all in all, sadly, I think this last Fine Gael Fianna Fáil budget of this Dáil, it was just generally a non-event.